October 24th, 1942, brought an oppressive darkness to Guadalcanal that felt heavier than usual. Sergeant John Bacelone crouched behind his water-cooled Browning machine gun, feeling the humid air cling to his skin like a warning. The jungle surrounding Henderson Field had fallen silent, too silent for comfort.
Ow.
Even the insects seemed to sense what was coming. At 31 years old, the former Army soldier turned Marine had seen enough combat to know that silence in war meant only one thing. The enemy was gathering its strength for something massive. The Marines of 1st Battalion. 7th Regiment had been entrenched along the Lunga Ridge for days, their eyes straining into the blackness beyond the perimeter. Intelligence reports suggested something big was brewing, but no one could predict the scale of what approached through the jungle that night. Bacelone commanded a heavy machine gun section, just 15 men spread across a narrow corridor that represented one of the most vulnerable approaches to the airfield. Behind them, Henderson Field stood as the single most important piece of American-held territory in the Solomon Islands, the only operational airstrip that could support the Allied advance across the Pacific. The significance of their position could not be overstated, according to military historian Richard Frank's account in Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle. Henderson Field represented the strategic pivot point of the entire Pacific campaign in late 1942. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the Solomon Islands, and whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the sea lanes to Australia. For the Japanese Imperial Army, recapturing it had become an obsession. For the Marines defending it, surrender was not merely unthinkable, it was impossible. Bacelone checked his ammunition belts for the 100th time that evening. Each belt held 250 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, and he had stockpiled as many as he could carry to his position. His machine gun, a Modus that weighed over 40 pounds without water and ammunition, was positioned to create interlocking fields of fire with the other gun sections. Private First Class Nash W. Phillips crouched beside him, feeding assistant, while the rest of the section manned 2 additional machine guns positioned 30 yards to either side. The battle plan was simple because it had to be. The Japanese would come in waves, likely attempting to overwhelm American positions through sheer numerical superiority and the fanaticism that characterized their infantry tactics. The Marines would hold the line with concentrated machine gun fire, creating kill zones that would turn the jungle approaches into corridors of death. Plans Bacelone knew rarely survived contact with the enemy. Around midnight, the first artillery shells began falling. Japanese heavy guns positioned in the hills beyond American lines opened up with a barrage that shook the earth and sent shrapnel screaming through the trees. Bacelone pressed himself against the sandbags as explosions erupted across the ridge. The bombardment lasted 30 minutes, a calculated effort to soften American defenses and disorient the defenders before the infantry assault. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. Then came the screaming. From the jungle emerged a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Thousands of Japanese soldiers yelling "Banzai" as they charged through the darkness. The assault had begun, and Sergeant John Bacelone's gun position stood directly in its path. What happened over the next 10 hours would become one of the most extraordinary displays of courage and skill in Marine Corps history. A testament to what determined men could accomplish when faced with impossible odds. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment, under the command of Major General Masao Maruyama, had been moving through the jungle for 6 days, hacking their way through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Nearly 2,700 soldiers, hungry, exhausted, but driven by absolute devotion to their emperor, now descended upon the American positions like a human avalanche. Their objective was clear: break through the Marine lines, seize Henderson Field, and restore Japanese control over Guadalcanal. Standing between them and victory were 33 Marines, and at the center of those Marines stood John Bacelone. The machine gun section's position occupied a slight rise that overlooked a natural approach through the jungle. Bacelone had chosen it precisely because it offered unobstructed fields of fire while providing some cover from direct assault. As the first wave of Japanese infantry emerged from the tree line, approximately 50 yards away, he pressed his thumbs against the butterfly trigger of his Browning. The weapon roared to life, sending a stream of tracer rounds into the advancing mass. The effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers fell in clusters as the heavy machine gun rounds tore through their ranks, but they kept coming. This was the terrifying reality of fighting the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942. They did not retreat. Individual soldiers, even when wounded, continued advancing until they were physically incapable of movement. Officers led from the front, swords raised, screaming encouragement to their men as bullets cut them down. Within minutes, the calculated defensive plan began falling apart. The sheer volume of attacking soldiers overwhelmed the prepared fields of fire. Japanese infantry, many armed with Arisaka rifles and light machine guns, began establishing firing positions in shell craters and behind fallen trees. The machine gun to Bacelon's left, manned by Corporal James Jonjek and his crew, fell silent abruptly. Enemy fire had either killed the crew or disabled the weapon. Bacelon made an instant decision. Leaving his gun in Phillips's capable hands, he grabbed 2 ammunition belts and crawled through incoming fire toward the disabled position. Bullets kicked up dirt around him, and mortar rounds exploded close enough to shower him with debris. When he reached Jonjek's position, he found 2 Marines dead and the gun's barrel jacket ruptured, rendering it useless. The gap in their defensive line was now 15 yards wide, and Japanese soldiers were already exploiting it. Bacelon snatched up his M1911 pistol and dropped all 3 attackers with calculated precision. Each shot fired with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had transcended fear. He then cleared the jammed belt, reloaded the machine gun, and resumed firing, sweeping the barrel across the advancing Japanese line. The gun's barrel began glowing red from continuous fire, heating the water in its cooling jacket to boiling temperatures. Steam hissed from the jacket, seams as Bacelon maintained pressure on the trigger, knowing that if his gun fell silent even for a moment, the position would be overrun. The first wave finally broke around 200 hours, leaving scores of Japanese dead piled before the Marine positions. But there was no time to celebrate. Through the darkness, Bacelon could hear Japanese officers rallying their troops for another assault. The second wave would come soon, and his ammunition supply was already critically low. He had perhaps 2,000 rounds remaining, a supply that seemed abundant until one calculated that his machine gun fired 400 to 500 rounds per minute. At maximum rate of fire, he had less than 5 minutes of ammunition left. The night, however, was far from over. The brief lull after the first wave provided no relief, only a temporary reprieve to assess the catastrophic situation developing along the ridge. Bacelon moved among his remaining gun crews, checking casualties and redistributing ammunition. Of his original 15-man section, 3 were already dead and 2 more were wounded but still fighting. The math was brutal and simple. They were losing this battle through attrition. Even if they killed 10 Japanese soldiers for every Marine lost, the enemy's numerical advantage would eventually overwhelm them. Around 0 to 30 hours, approximately 2:30 in the morning, a runner from battalion headquarters crawled into Bacelon's position. The young private, barely 19 years old, was wild-eyed and breathing hard. He carried orders from Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, the battalion commander whose reputation for aggressive defense matched his gravelly voice and iron will. The message was characteristically direct: hold your position at all costs. No withdrawal. Reinforcements cannot be spared. Bacelon understood perfectly. Other sections along the perimeter were facing similar attacks. The entire American defensive line was being tested simultaneously, a coordinated Japanese assault designed to find and exploit any weakness. If his section fell back, it would create a penetration that could collapse the entire flank. Henderson Field would fall, and with it, potentially the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders as he sent the runner back with a simple reply: "We'll hold." But holding required ammunition, and ammunition was becoming critically scarce. The initial supply dump established behind the gun positions had been hit by Japanese mortar fire during the preliminary bombardment, destroying approximately 40% of their reserve belts. Bacelon made another calculation. If they rationed fire, using short bursts instead of sustained sweeps, they might have enough to last until dawn. The problem with that strategy was that short bursts might not generate enough volume of fire to stop determined infantry charges. The second wave hit at 0300 hours, approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, and it came with a new tactical wrinkle. Japanese infiltrators, small teams of soldiers who had crept forward during the lull, suddenly opened fire from the flanks. These soldiers had crawled past the machine gun positions under cover of darkness, accepting horrific casualties to get within striking distance. Now they attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, creating chaos in the Marine defensive line. Private First Class Nash Phillips, who survived the battle and later provided testimony for Basalone's Medal of Honor citation, described watching his sergeant work with what he called mechanical precision born from pure adrenaline. Basalone's hands moved across the weapon with practiced efficiency, changing ammunition belts in darkness without fumbling, feeling for jams and clearing them by touch, monitoring the water level in the cooling jacket by the sound of the boiling water inside it. This was not heroism in the Hollywood sense of reckless bravery. This was craftsmanship applied under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The second wave finally receded around 0400 hours, approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, but at a terrible cost to both sides. Japanese casualties were mounting into the hundreds, with their dead stacked in grotesque piles before the Marine positions. But Basalone's section was now down to 8 effective fighters, and his primary machine gun was barely functional. The barrel was warped from heat, the cooling jacket was leaking, and the entire weapon threatened to fail catastrophically at any moment. Dawn was still 2 hours away, and intelligence suggested at least one more major assault was coming. The question was no longer whether they could hold, but whether they would survive long enough to see sunrise. 0 for 15 hours brought a problem that threatened to accomplish what the Japanese infantry could not: complete ammunition exhaustion. Basalone conducted a rapid inventory and discovered they were down to fewer than 800 rounds of machine gun ammunition across all remaining weapons. At their current rate of expenditure, that represented perhaps 10 to 15 minutes of defensive fire. After that, they would be reduced to rifles, pistols, and whatever Japanese weapons they could scavenge from the dead. Against an enemy that still numbered in the thousands, such weapons would be nearly useless. The nearest ammunition supply point was located approximately 300 yards to the rear, positioned near battalion headquarters where it could service multiple sections along the perimeter. Under normal circumstances, ammunition bearers would make regular runs to keep the forward position supplied. But these were not normal circumstances. The routes between supply points and fighting positions were now under direct observation by Japanese infiltrators, who had learned to target anyone moving along the communication trenches. 3 ammunition bearers had already been killed, attempting resupply runs that night, their bodies sprawled along the paths they had tried to navigate. Basalone faced a choice that military theorists would later study in command courses at Quantico: abandon his position and personally retrieve ammunition, leaving his depleted section vulnerable during his absence, or remain in place and face certain overrun when the ammunition ran out. Both options risked complete failure. The difference was that one option, however dangerous, offered the possibility of continued resistance. He made his decision quickly, stripping off his pack and helmet to reduce noise and profile. Aldalone turned his machine gun over to Phillips with instructions to conserve ammunition until the next assault became unavoidable. Then, as Japanese flares lit up the night sky and enemy machine gun fire swept across the ridge, he crawled out of his fighting position and began moving toward the supply point. What followed was an odyssey that would become legendary among the Marines who learned of it later. The 300-yard journey took nearly 40 minutes. Baselone moved through terrain that was actively being contested, crawling past Japanese dead and occasionally Japanese wounded, who watched him pass with eyes that reflected either hatred or indifference to their own mortality. Twice he encountered Japanese soldiers moving in the opposite direction, likely infiltrators attempting to reach the American rear areas. Both encounters ended in close-quarters knifework, brutal and silent, the kind of fighting that left no room for hesitation or mercy. According to subsequent accounts verified by multiple sources and documented in Marine Corps historical records, Baselone reached the supply point to find it under attack by a Japanese squad attempting to destroy American ammunition reserves. The squad had already killed the supply personnel and was in the process of setting demolition charges when Baselone arrived. What happened next was described by Corporal Stephen Helstowski, one of the supply point defenders who survived the engagement. Baselone, armed only with his pistol and fighting knife, attacked the Japanese squad from the flank. In close combat that lasted perhaps 90 seconds, but which Helstowski described as the longest minute and a half of my life, Baselone killed 3 Japanese soldiers and drove off the remainder, saving the supply dump from destruction. He then, despite Helstowski's offers of assistance, loaded himself down with 6 ammunition belts, approximately 90 pounds of linked rounds, and began the journey back to his position. The return trip was even more harrowing than the outbound journey. The Japanese, sensing weakness in the American lines, had intensified their probing attacks. Small squads of infantry were moving through the gaps between positions, searching for penetration points. Baselone, heavily laden with ammunition and unable to move quickly, had to navigate through this increasingly crowded battlefield. At one point, he lay motionless for 7 minutes while a Japanese patrol of 12 men passed within 5 feet of his position, their attention focused forward on the American lines they were attempting to infiltrate. When he finally crawled back into his gun position, at approximately 0500 hours, roughly 5 o'clock in the morning, Phillips and the remaining Marines greeted him with expressions that mixed relief with disbelief. They had heard firing from multiple directions during his absence and had assumed he was dead. The ammunition he brought back represented life itself, the difference between continued resistance and annihilation. But there was no time for reunion or celebration. Even as Baselone was reloading his machine gun with fresh belts, new sounds emerged from the jungle. The Japanese were forming up for what intelligence would later identify as their final, a loud assault on this section of the line. Major General Maruyama had committed his remaining reserves to one last push. Nearly 1,000 fresh soldiers, men who had been held back during the previous waves, now prepared to overwhelm the American positions through sheer mass. Japanese officers moved among their troops, delivering final instructions and inspiration. This attack would not be a probing assault or a limited objective operation. This would be a human wave, a banzai charge in its purest and most terrifying form, designed to carry the position regardless of casualties. Baselone checked his machine gun one final time. The weapon was barely holding together, its barrel warped and discolored, its cooling jacket leaking water that formed small puddles in the bottom of the fighting position. But it was still functional, and that was all that mattered. He settled behind the gun, positioned the first belt into the feed tray, and waited for what he knew was coming. Dawn was perhaps 90 minutes away. The question was whether any of them would live to see it. 0530 hours marked the beginning of what survivors would later describe as less a battle than a slaughter. Though which side suffered more in absolute terms remained a matter of mathematical calculation rather than clear military advantage. The Japanese final assault began not with the traditional banzai screams that had characterized earlier waves, but with an eerie, coordinated silence. Nearly 1,000 soldiers emerged from the jungle tree line in a formation that suggested careful planning rather than desperate fanaticism. They advanced in disciplined ranks, officers positioned at regular intervals, moving forward with the mechanical precision of men who understood they were already dead and needed only to accomplish their mission before that death claimed them. Baselone held his fire. Every Marine Corps machine gunner learned the same fundamental principle. Let them close to effective range. Let them commit to their attack vector. Then open fire when retreat becomes psychologically impossible. At 50 yards, the advancing Japanese ranks remained silent, their rifles held at port arms. At 40 yards, Baselone could see individual faces in the pre-dawn gloom, young men whose expressions showed determination rather than fear. At 30 yards, the entire front rank suddenly screamed in unison, breaking from their disciplined advance into a charging sprint. The machine gun opened up, and the night transformed into chaos incarnate. The heavy Browning rounds, fired at maximum rate now that ammunition constraints were temporarily alleviated, tore through the Japanese formation like a scythe through wheat. The military physics of machine gun fire against massed infantry are brutal and unforgiving. Each round that struck a human body in the front rank often retained sufficient energy to wound or kill soldiers in the second and third ranks behind. Barcelone traversed the gun left to right across the charging formation, then back again, creating overlapping zones of fire that turned the 30-yard gap between positions into a killing field. But the Japanese kept coming. This was the horrifying reality that would haunt Marine survivors for decades afterward: the sheer courage, or fanaticism, or devotion, depending on one's perspective, that drove Japanese infantry to continue advancing through fire that would have broken any Western military formation. As the front ranks fell, those behind simply stepped over their bodies and maintained the charge. Officers continued leading even after being wounded, waving swords and pistols, shouting encouragement that could be heard even over the machine gun fire. The gun's barrel began glowing white-hot, visible even in darkness. The cooling jacket's water reached boiling point and began venting steam in pressurized jets that scalded. Barcelone's hands as he maintained pressure on the butterfly trigger. Phillips, working as assistant gunner, fed belt after belt into the weapon, his own hands burning from the heat radiating off the gun's receiver. Around them, the few remaining Marines in the section fired rifles as quickly as they could work their bolts, adding their individual contributions to the volume of fire. At 20 yards, the first Japanese soldiers broke through. A squad of 5 men, all wounded but still functional, reached the edge of Barcelone's position before being cut down by pistol fire. Their bodies fell across the sandbags so close that Barcelone could smell the distinctive odor of their uniforms, a combination of sweat, jungle mold, and the rice-based rations that characterized Japanese military logistics. More followed immediately behind them, an endless stream of attackers who seemed willing to climb over their own dead to reach the American guns. For 17 minutes, according to later time-track reconstructions from battalion headquarters logs, Barcelone's machine gun fired continuously, without pause. 17 minutes represents an eternity in combat, a period during which the human mind cannot maintain normal cognitive function and instead operates on trained instinct and muscle memory. Barcelone later claimed to have no memory of this period, describing it as a blur of loading and firing and bodies falling. Phillips corroborated this account, noting that his sergeant seemed to enter a trance state, his hands working the machine gun with mechanical precision while his eyes remained fixed on the kill zone ahead. The weapon finally failed at 05:47 hours. The barrel warping, accumulated over hours of sustained fire, finally exceeded the tolerance limits of the weapon's design. The barrel jammed inside the receiver, freezing the mechanism and rendering the gun immediately inoperable. The timing could not have been worse. Approximately 200 Japanese soldiers remained in the assault wave, and they were now within grenade-throwing distance of the Marine positions. What happened next would become the most controversial aspect of Barcelone's Medal of Honor citation, not because anyone doubted its occurrence, but because the sheer physical improbability of it seemed to defy rational explanation. With his primary weapon disabled, Barcelone stripped the barrel assembly from the broken machine gun, a component that weighed approximately 25 pounds and was still radiating enough heat to cause severe burns. Using this improvised club, still glowing red at one end, he engaged Japanese soldiers who breached his position in hand-to-hand combat. The fighting devolved into a primal struggle for survival that bore little resemblance to tactical warfare. Barcelone swung the superheated barrel like a medieval mace, the glowing metal leaving burns on anyone it contacted. Japanese soldiers, many already wounded from the earlier machine gun fire, found themselves facing an opponent who seemed to embody pure, desperate violence. The few Marines remaining in the section fought alongside their sergeant, using rifles as clubs when ammunition ran out, stabbing with knives when rifles broke, fighting with fists and stones when all manufactured weapons failed. This savage melee lasted approximately 8 minutes, though again, survivors' time estimates varied wildly. When it finally ended, 19 Japanese soldiers lay dead within the immediate perimeter of Barcelona's position, killed at distances ranging from point-blank to literally arm's length. The sergeant himself was wounded in multiple places, shrapnel lacerations. A bayonet cut across his left forearm, burns covering both hands from the superheated gun barrel. But he was alive, and more importantly, his position had not fallen. The third and final Japanese assault wave had broken against his section's desperate defense. 0600 hours, approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, brought the first gray light of dawn, filtering through the jungle canopy. This transitional period, which military veterans often call the golden hour for the particular quality of light it produces, revealed a landscape transformed into something resembling medieval battlefields from history books. Bodies lay piled in windrows before the Marine positions, evidence of the night's butchery rendered visible and undeniable in the growing light. The smell, which darkness had mercifully concealed, now became overwhelming. Cordite, blood, voided bowels, and the beginning stages of rapid tropical decomposition. Barcelona stood among the wreckage of his machine gun position, surveying the scene with eyes that had witnessed horrors no training could prepare someone to process. His hands, severely burned and beginning to swell, hung at his sides. Blood from various wounds had soaked through his uniform in multiple places. His face was blackened from powder smoke and dirt, making his eyes appear unnaturally white by contrast. Round him, 5 Marines remained alive from the original 15-man section. They sat or lay in various states of exhaustion, too depleted to speak, barely capable of maintaining consciousness. The Japanese, however, were not finished. Major General Maruyama's headquarters, positioned in the jungle approximately 2 miles from the battlefield, had not yet received accurate casualty reports. Japanese communications, never robust in jungle terrain, had broken down almost completely during the night's fighting. Maruyama believed, based on optimistic reports from subordinate commanders, that his forces had achieved penetration of the American lines and that Henderson Field was within reach. He ordered his remaining reserves, approximately 300 soldiers, to exploit what he believed was success and complete the capture of the airfield. The final Japanese assault, when it came, lacked the coordinated ferocity of the earlier waves. The attacking soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and increasingly aware that their offensive had failed. Many were wounded from earlier fighting, but had been pressed into service for this last effort. They advanced without the discipline or determination that had characterized the night's attacks. And they broke quickly when they encountered fresh Marine positions, reinforced with multiple machine guns and adequate ammunition supplies. By 0730 hours, approximately 7:30 in the morning, the Battle of Henderson Field on this sector of the perimeter was effectively over. Japanese forces were withdrawing into the jungle, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead where they had fallen. American casualties were being evacuated to the field hospital near Henderson Field, where Navy doctors performed triage under conditions that would have been familiar to surgeons from the American Civil War. The wounded outnumbered available medical personnel by ratios that forced terrible decisions about who received treatment and who received morphine and comfort. Barcelona finally consented to medical evacuation at 0800 hours, approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, but only after personally confirming that fresh troops had taken over his sector and that adequate ammunition supplies were available. He walked to the aid station under his own power, refusing a stretcher despite obvious difficulty maintaining balance. The Navy corpsman who treated his burns later recalled that the sergeant's hands were so severely damaged that skin came off in sheets when they tried to remove his gloves. Yet during the entire treatment process, Barcelone reportedly asked only one question: when could he return to his position? The butcher's bill for the night's fighting emerged gradually as reports filtered back to headquarters throughout the morning. Japanese casualties exceeded 700 dead in the sector defended by Barcelone's section alone, with perhaps twice that number wounded. American casualties in the same sector, 12 dead and 8 wounded, though 2 of the wounded would die later from their injuries. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. 33 Marines had held against approximately 2,700 attackers, inflicting a casualty ratio that military historians would later struggle to explain through conventional tactical analysis. Colonel Amor Leroy Sims, the regimental commander, visited Beau Sloan in the field hospital that afternoon. The colonel, a career officer who had served in France during World War I and who was not easily impressed, reportedly stood silently beside the sergeant's cat for a full minute before speaking. When he finally did speak, his words were characteristically direct. "Sergeant, I'm going to recommend you for the Medal of Honor. What you did last night was beyond anything I've seen in 30 years of service." Barcelone's response, according to witnesses, was to ask when he could rejoin his section. But the sergeant's war was not over. The broader battle for Henderson Field would continue for several more days as Japanese forces made repeated attempts to recapture the airfield. Other sections of the perimeter faced their own desperate defenses, their own moments of crisis, where individual courage determined collective survival. The entire Guadalcanal campaign would drag on for months, consuming men and materiel in a grinding attritional struggle that neither side could afford to lose. Yet even in this broader context of sustained combat, the events of October 24th through 25th stood out as exceptional. The days following the battle brought a strange dissonance to Guadalcanal. Henderson Field remained operational, its runways continuing to support American air operations that interdicted Japanese supply lines and provided close air support to ground forces. Marines went about their duties with the mechanical efficiency of men who understood that survival depended on routine and discipline. Yet beneath this surface normalcy lay a growing awareness that something extraordinary had occurred on the night of October 24th, something that transcended typical combat performance. Barcelone returned to duty on October 28th, just 3 days after the battle. His hands remained heavily bandaged, making it impossible for him to operate a machine gun with his previous dexterity. Navy doctors had recommended at least 2 weeks of light duty, followed by potential medical evacuation to rear area hospitals for more comprehensive treatment. The sergeant ignored these recommendations, stating that his section was under strength and needed experienced leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Pooler, recognizing both the practical need and the psychological impact of having Barcelone visible and active, approved his return to full-duty status. The process of documenting the battle for official records began almost immediately. Marine Corps regulations required after-action reports for any significant combat engagement. And the defense of Henderson Field certainly qualified as significant. Multiple officers interviewed survivors from Barcelone's section, compiling testimony that would eventually form the basis of his Medal of Honor citation. These interviews revealed details that had been obscured in the chaos of night fighting: the ammunition resupply run, the hand-to-hand combat, the sustained machine gun operation under conditions that should have rendered such operation impossible. Private First Class Nash Phillips provided particularly detailed testimony, documenting not just what Barcelone had done, but how he had done it. Phillips described watching his sergeant work with what he termed mechanical precision born of perfect training meeting absolute necessity. This testimony proved crucial in later years when military historians attempted to understand how one man could accomplish what seemed physically impossible. The answer, according to Phillips and others who survived the battle, lay not in superhuman strength or reckless courage, but in perfect application of training under maximum stress. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved through military channels with unusual speed. Colonel Sims forwarded the recommendation to Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, on November 2nd, just 9 days after the battle. Vandegrift, who had personally visited the battlefield site and examined the physical evidence of the night's fighting, added his strong endorsement and forwarded the recommendation to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz approved the recommendation on November 15th and forwarded it to the Secretary of the Navy. On May 21, 1943, approximately 7 months after the battle, Sergeant John Bacelone received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at Australia's Melbourne Cricket Ground. Major General Vandegrift personally presented the medal before a formation that included the entire 1st Marine Division and various Australian and Allied units. The citation, read aloud before thousands of assembled personnel, detailed Bacelone's actions with language that attempted to capture the scope of his achievement while maintaining the formal precision required of official military documents. The citation's key passage, which would be quoted in countless subsequent accounts, read: "Serving as a leader of a machine gun section, Sergeant Bacelone, in action against enemy Japanese forces in the Lunga area, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, on October 24th and 25th, 1942. While the enemy was hammering at the Marines' defensive positions, Sergeant Bacelone, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, fought valiantly to check the savage and determined assault. In a fierce frontal attack with the Japanese blasting his guns with grenades and mortar fire, one of Sergeant Bacelone's sections, with its gun crews, was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to carry on. Moving an extra gun into position, he placed it in action, then, under continual fire, repaired another and personally manned it, gallantly holding his line until replacements arrived." The citation continued, describing the ammunition resupply run and concluding with words that attempted to summarize the impact of his actions. His great personal valor and courageous initiative were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. These formal words, necessary for official documentation, could not fully capture the reality of what had occurred on that October night. But they served their purpose. They placed John Bacelone in the elite company of Medal of Honor recipients, men whose actions had exceeded the already extraordinary standards of military service. The medal brought fame that Bacelone neither sought nor particularly wanted. The Marine Corps, recognizing the propaganda value of a living Medal of Honor recipient, sent him back to the United States for a war bond tour in 1943. He traveled across America, speaking at rallies and bond drives, his image appearing on recruiting posters and in newsreels. He raised approximately $1.4 million in war bonds during this tour, a sum that translated to substantial material support for the war effort. Yet those who knew him reported that he found the experience deeply uncomfortable, preferring the straightforward dangers of combat to the complexity of celebrity. The most revealing indication of Bacelone's character came in his persistent requests to return to combat duty. Despite opportunities for permanent stateside assignment, despite the Marine Corps' obvious reluctance to risk losing a valuable propaganda asset, he continually volunteered for deployment back to the Pacific. In December 1943, the Marine Corps finally approved his request. Sergeant John Bacelone returned to combat operations, assigned to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. His return to the Pacific Theater would prove tragically brief. On February 19, 1945, Bacelone participated in the invasion of Iwo Jima. He landed with the initial assault waves on Red Beach, leading a machine gun platoon against Japanese fortifications. He was killed in action that same day, struck by mortar fire while guiding a tank through a minefield. He was 31 years old, the same age he had been during the defense of Henderson Field. For his actions on Iwo Jima, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, making him one of only a handful of Marines to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. To understand the full significance of the events on October 24th and 25th, 1942, one must examine the broader strategic situation in the Pacific Theater during that critical period. The battle for Guadalcanal represented far more than a localized struggle for one island in an obscure chain. It constituted a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, the first major Allied offensive operation against Japanese forces, and a test case for whether American military forces could successfully challenge Japanese territorial expansion. The Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, initiated with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had proceeded with stunning success through the first half of 1942. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guamal, fell to Japanese forces in a 6-month campaign that shattered the pre-war strategic assumptions of Western military planners. By June 1942, Japan controlled an area extending from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, encompassing approximately 1/7 of the Earth's surface and containing crucial resources, including oil, rubber, and rice. The American victory at the Battle of Midway in early June 1942, while strategically significant, had not immediately reversed this situation. Japan still possessed substantial naval forces, still controlled vast territories, and still maintained the strategic initiative across most of the Pacific theater. American military planners meeting in Washington and Pearl Harbor debated how to begin the long process of reversing Japanese conquests. The result was Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal and Tulagi and the Solomon Islands, launched on August 7, 1942. Henderson Field, constructed by Japanese forces before being captured by American Marines, became the strategic prize around which the entire Guadalcanal campaign revolved. An airfield in the Solomons provided control over the sea lanes between the United States and Australia, allowed interdiction of Japanese supply lines to the South Pacific, and offered a staging base for future operations toward the Philippines and ultimately Japan itself. Both sides understood these strategic realities, which transformed Guadalcanal from a minor island into contested ground where neither side could afford defeat. According to military historian Samuel Eliot Morison, whose 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II remains the definitive account of the Pacific War's naval campaigns, Guadalcanal became a focal point not through careful strategic planning, but through the logic of geography and the accidents of campaign development. Once American forces had landed, however, it acquired an importance that transcended its physical dimensions. This analysis, written with the benefit of post-war perspective and access to both American and Japanese military documents, underscores how the defense of Henderson Field on October 24th represented a critical moment in this broader strategic struggle. The Japanese offensive that Bacelone and his fellow Marines faced that night was not a localized tactical operation, but part of a comprehensive Japanese plan to recapture Guadalcanal. Major General Masao Motoyama commanded the Sendai Division, a veteran formation that had participated in the conquest of Borneo, Java, and New Guinea. His orders from Imperial General Headquarters were explicit: recapture Henderson Field regardless of cost. The division's approach marched through Guadalcanal's interior jungle, which took 6 days and during which many soldiers abandoned their heavy equipment and even portions of their rations, demonstrated the Japanese High Command's determination to accomplish this objective. The assault plan called for simultaneous attacks along multiple sections of the American perimeter, designed to prevent Marine commanders from reinforcing threatened sectors with reserves. Japanese intelligence had identified several weak points in the American defensive line, including the sector defended by Bacelone's section. The plan assumed that sustained infantry assaults, supported by artillery and accepting high casualties, would eventually break through at one or more points. Once penetration was achieved, follow-on forces would exploit toward Henderson Field, seize the airstrip, and cut off American forces from aerial resupply and support. The plan failed, not through any fundamental flaw in its strategic logic, but through the tactical reality that defenders who refused to break could not be broken by infantry assault alone. Bacelone's section represented a microcosm of this broader dynamic. Japanese forces achieved surprise, achieved local numerical superiority, and pressed their attacks with characteristic determination. Yet they failed to achieve penetration because the defending Marines, despite catastrophic casualties and equipment failures, maintained their positions and their volume of fire. The broader battle for Henderson Field, spanning October 23rd through 26th, resulted in approximately 1,500 Japanese deaths and approximately 200 American casualties. These ratios, shocking by the standards of warfare on the Western Front during World War I, or even by the standards of other Pacific engagements, reflected several factors: the advantages of prepared defensive positions, the effectiveness of American crew-served weapons when properly employed, and the Japanese tactical doctrine that emphasized spirit and determination over firepower and maneuver. American intelligence officers interrogating Japanese prisoners after the battle discovered that many attacking soldiers had been given minimal rations and told that American supplies would be available once Henderson Field was captured. This suggested a level of logistical optimism bordering on fantasy, reflecting either desperate circumstances or fundamental misunderstanding of American defensive capabilities. The prisoners also reported that their officers had briefed them to expect American forces to withdraw or surrender when faced with determined assault, a tactical assumption that proved catastrophically incorrect. The strategic consequences of the Japanese failure became apparent in the weeks following the battle. Unable to recapture Henderson Field through ground assault, Japanese commanders attempted to reinforce their Guadalcanal garrison through naval operations, leading to a series of naval battles in November 1942 that resulted in heavy losses for both sides. These naval engagements, fought at night in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal, became some of the most intense surface combat of the Pacific War, yet they could not alter the fundamental strategic reality. As long as Henderson Field remained operational, American forces controlled the airspace around Guadalcanal, and control of airspace increasingly determined control of territory in modern warfare. Beyond these strategic analyses and tactical reconstructions, the events of October 24th and 25th revealed profound truths about human behavior under extreme stress. Military psychologists in later decades would study the Guadalcanal defensive actions as case studies in how individuals and small units function when facing death, not as an abstract possibility, but as an immediate, overwhelming presence. The insights gained from these studies informed training programs and leadership development across the American military. Private First Class Robert Leader, another survivor from Barcelona's section, provided testimony years later that illuminated the psychological dynamics of the defense. In an oral history interview conducted in 1983, 41 years after the battle, Leader described the experience with clarity that suggested some memories remain permanently vivid regardless of intervening time. "You reach a point where fear stops meaning anything," he explained. "Not because you stop being afraid, but because the fear becomes so constant that it turns into something else. Background noise in your head? You keep functioning because stopping would mean death, and some primitive part of your brain won't allow stopping." This description aligns with subsequent research into combat stress reactions and the phenomena that military psychiatrists call paradoxical calm under fire. Soldiers in extended combat situations often report entering psychological states where normal emotional responses become muted or absent, replaced by a hyper-focused awareness of immediate tactical requirements. This state, while useful for short-term survival, carries long-term psychological costs that Vietnam War-era research would later quantify as post-traumatic stress disorder. The leadership question: how Barcelona maintained not just his own performance but inspired continued resistance among exhausted Marines proved particularly interesting to military analysts. Effective combat leadership under such circumstances requires simultaneous mastery of multiple domains: technical proficiency with weapons, tactical understanding of defensive principles, physical courage to perform under fire, and psychological insight to motivate others when all rational motivation has evaporated. Barcelona apparently possessed all these qualities in sufficient measure to overcome circumstances that should have resulted in position collapse. Captain Henry Buse, operations officer for the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines during the battle, later wrote in his memoir that Barcelona represented the ideal type of non-commissioned officer, the kind that makes the American military system function effectively. This comment reflected a fundamental truth about military organization. Officers may plan operations and issue orders, but sergeants execute those orders at the squad and section level where tactical success or failure is actually determined. Barcelona's ability to execute under the worst possible circumstances validated the entire system of enlisted leadership development. The physical toll of the battle manifested in ways that extended far beyond immediate wounds. Barcelona's burned hands required months of treatment and never fully recovered their pre-battle sensitivity. Other survivors reported hearing damage from sustained exposure to machine gun fire at close range, damage that 1940s audiology could identify but not effectively treat. Several Marines from the section developed what contemporary doctors diagnosed as combat fatigue, but which modern practitioners would recognize as acute stress reactions requiring psychiatric intervention. The unit cohesion that kept the section fighting through the night deserved particular examination. Military sociologists have long recognized that soldiers often fight not for abstract causes or distant objectives, but for the men immediately beside them. The bonds formed in shared hardship and danger create powerful motivations that can overcome survival instinct and rational self-interest. Barcelona's section exemplified this dynamic. Marines continued fighting not because they believed their resistance would alter the war's outcome, but because their comrades were fighting, and abandoning those comrades was psychologically impossible. Interestingly, Japanese survivors from the attacking force reported similar psychological dynamics. Soldiers interviewed after being captured described feeling compelled to continue attacking even when tactical circumstances made success impossible. The difference lay in how these psychological dynamics were channeled. American military culture emphasized small unit cohesion and mutual support, while Japanese military culture emphasized obedience to authority and devotion to emperor. Both systems generated extraordinary combat performance, but the American approach proved more sustainable under extended operations. The moral dimension of the battle generated discussion among military ethicists and chaplains who accompanied American forces in the Pacific. The sheer lethality of the defensive fire, the sustained killing conducted over hours against attackers who refused to surrender or withdraw, raised questions about the psychological impact on those required to conduct such killing. Navy chaplains on Guadalcanal reported significant increases in requests for counseling from Marines who had participated in the October 24th defense, suggesting that even legally and morally justified combat killing carries psychological costs. Father Frederick Goring, Catholic chaplain for the 7th Marines, recorded in his diary an entry dated October 28th that captured this moral complexity. The men are celebrating their victory, as they should. They held against impossible odds and saved the field. But I see in their eyes something that troubles me. They have looked into an abyss, have done things necessary for survival but terrible in themselves, and they carry that knowledge now. It will mark them forever. This observation, made by a man whose duties required him to understand human psychology in extremis, suggested that the costs of victory extended beyond casualty lists and equipment losses. The families of those killed in the battle received telegrams in early November, brief official notifications that provided minimal information and no context. Mrs. Dorothy Morrison of Cleveland, Ohio, received notification that her son, Private First Class James Morrison, had been killed in action on Guadalcanal on October 24th. Years later, she would learn from survivors' accounts that her son had died manning one of the flanking machine guns, continuing to fire even after being wounded, buying time for his comrades through his sacrifice. Such details, unknown to families at the time, represented countless individual stories of courage that comprised the broader narrative of the battle. The defense of Henderson Field on October 24th and 25th, 1942, entered Marine Corps institutional memory as both historical event and pedagogical tool. The action became required study at Marine Corps officer and non-commissioned officer schools, dissected for tactical lessons and leadership principles. Yet the most important legacy of that night extended beyond tactical technique to encompass fundamental questions about human capability under extreme stress and the nature of defensive operations in modern warfare. Marine Corps schools at Quantico began using the Henderson Field defense as a case study in 1946, just 4 years after the battle. The tactical problem presented to student officers was straightforward. Given a heavily outnumbered defensive position, inadequate ammunition supplies, and determined enemy attack, what actions should a section leader take to maximize defensive effectiveness? Students' proposed solutions were then compared against Barcelona's actual decisions during the battle, generating discussions about risk assessment, resource management, and tactical flexibility under pressure. These classroom exercises revealed that Barcelona's decisions, while ultimately successful, violated certain conventional wisdom about defensive operations. His ammunition resupply run, for example, left his position temporarily without its most experienced leader at a critical moment in the battle. Standard tactical doctrines suggested sending subordinates on such missions while commanders remained to direct the defense. Yet Barcelona's assessment was that his subordinates lacked the experience and skill to successfully complete the mission under fire, making his personal involvement the only viable option despite the risks. This willingness to violate doctrine when circumstances demanded became a key teaching point. Effective military leadership, the case study suggested, required understanding not just what the manual prescribed, but when circumstances justified departure from prescribed procedures. The balance between adherence to doctrine and tactical flexibility represented one of the most difficult judgments military leaders faced. And Baselin's example provided concrete illustration of how that balance could be struck successfully. The historical record itself underwent revision and refinement over subsequent decades as new information emerged. Largely inaccessible during the immediate post-war period due to language barriers and destruction of documents, gradually became available to Western historians. These records provided Japanese perspectives on the battle, including casualty figures, tactical plans, and after-action assessments. The Japanese accounts confirmed American estimates of attacking force size and casualty ratios, lending additional credibility to what had sometimes seemed like exaggerated American claims. One particularly revealing Japanese document, post-battle report from Major General Matoyama's headquarters dated November 2, 1942, attributed the offensive's failure to several factors, including underestimation of American defensive capabilities and overestimation of Japanese soldiers' ability to sustain combat effectiveness after extended jungle marches with inadequate rations. The report specifically mentioned the sector defended by Baselin's section, noting that enemy resistance at the southwestern approach exceeded all expectations, with machine gun fire maintained at intensity, suggesting ammunition supplies far beyond our intelligence estimates. This Japanese assessment inadvertently highlighted Baselin's achievement. His ammunition resupply run had created the impression of abundant supplies, contributing to Japanese tactical confusion and potentially influencing their decision to break off attacks that might otherwise have continued. The psychological impact of sustained defensive fire, suggesting reserves and capabilities that might not actually exist, demonstrated how individual tactical actions could generate operational-level effects. The personal legacy of John Baselon grew to encompass myth and reality in proportions that historical scholarship continues to debate. His life story became the subject of books, documentaries, and eventually a prominent role in the HBO miniseries The Pacific, produced in 2010. Each telling emphasized different aspects of his character and actions, shaped by the storytelling needs of different mediums and eras. Yet beneath the various interpretations, certain facts remained constant and verified. A sergeant and his section held against overwhelming odds, inflicted catastrophic casualties on attacking forces, and preserved a strategic position at critical cost to themselves. The town of Raritan, New Jersey, Baselin's hometown, erected a memorial statue in his honor in 1951. The statue depicts Baselin manning his machine gun, frozen in bronze, at the moment of maximum exertion and commitment. Each year on September 4th, his birth date, the town holds a parade in his memory, maintaining connection between contemporary residents and a man whose actions in a distant jungle 70 years ago helped determine the course of global history. The broader lessons of Henderson Field's defense resonated through subsequent American military operations. During the Korean War, defensive actions at Pusan Perimeter and Chosin Reservoir saw Marines applying principles validated on Guadalcanal: concentrated firepower, its small unit cohesion, and leadership by example under extreme pressure. Vietnam War operations, despite their different character and controversial nature, similarly relied on Marines' institutional memory of how outnumbered units could survive through technical proficiency and determination. More recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan saw different tactical circumstances, insurgency rather than conventional warfare. Urban environments rather than jungle, yet the fundamental principles remained relevant. Small Marine units, often operating in isolated positions and facing numerically superior enemy forces, drew upon institutional traditions that trace directly back to actions like Baselin's defense. The phrase "every Marine a rifleman," embodying the Corps' emphasis on universal basic combat proficiency, reflected lessons learned when specialized machine gunners, like Baselin, had to fight with pistols, knives, and improvised weapons when their primary systems failed. The technological dimension deserves mention as well. The Browning M1917 machine gun that Baselin used at Henderson Field represented World War I-era technology. Water-cooled and heavy, designed for sustained defensive fire rather than mobile operations, modern machine guns, air-cooled and significantly lighter, offer greater tactical flexibility but less sustained fire capability. Military weapons designers continue studying the trade-offs between mobility and sustained firepower that the Browning exemplified, seeking optimal balances for contemporary operational requirements. The final assessment of that October night must acknowledge both the exceptional and the ordinary elements at play. Baselin's technical proficiency with his weapon, while exceptional in degree, represented successful application of standard Marine Corps training. His courage under fire, while worthy of the Medal of Honor, echoed courage displayed by countless other Marines in less documented circumstances. His leadership of a small unit through extreme crisis followed principles taught in every leadership course. What made his actions extraordinary was not that they involved superhuman capabilities, but that they demonstrated human capabilities at their extreme limits. Perhaps the most important legacy lies in what the defense revealed about human potential under crisis. Ordinary Manon Baselin was, by all accounts, before October 24th, a competent but unexceptional non-commissioned officer could rise to circumstances that seemed beyond human capability. They could function effectively while exhausted, wounded, terrified, and facing apparent certain death. They could maintain technical precision and tactical judgment when every psychological pressure pushed toward panic and collapse. They could, in short, exceed what seemed possible, not through supernatural intervention, but through training, leadership, and the bonds of unit cohesion. This understanding offers perhaps the most enduring lesson for military institutions and for broader human society. The defense of Henderson Field demonstrated that humans possess reserves of capability, courage, and endurance that emerge only under maximum stress. Whether such reserves should be called upon, what costs their use entails, and how society should honor those who display them, these remain questions without simple answers. That such reserves exist, that men like John Baselin could draw upon them when circumstances demanded, stands as a historical fact, verified by multiple sources, and honored in the only way a grateful nation knew how, through remembrance, recognition, and the commitment to never forget. When dawn finally broke fully over Guadalcanal on October 25, 1942, it revealed a battlefield transformed. The machine guns fell silent. The wounded received treatment. The dead began the process of being counted, identified, honored, according to the rituals that all armies use to acknowledge sacrifice. And one sergeant, hands burned and body battered, stood among the wreckage of his position, having accomplished something that would be studied, discussed, and honored for generations to come. He held the line when the line could not be held, and through holding it, changed history.